Everyone who has read Dune probably understands why the story could be difficult to adapt into film. Its world is very complex and it basically requires a lot of explanation. So, when I heard that they were going to make a movie about it, again, I was interested to see how they would tackle this problem. To start with, they split the novel into two movies. I can definitely see how having more time to tell the story is a good thing, but then there's also the fact that it might run the risk of interrupting the flow of the story. That's because each movie, in a lot of ways, needs to be able to stand on its own. They both need to have their own progression of events that leads towards a climax and a resolution. They each need to be about something, a theme, so the audience can walk out of the theater feeling like the film had meaning. Choosing where to cut the novel goes hand in hand with deciding the narratives and the themes of both movies. I'm now going to speculate about the reason why they cut the novel where they did and what it meant for the first movie. Needless to say, this will contain spoilers, but only for this first part. So they cut the story after Paul and his mom have met the Freemen. Paul has had his duel with one of the Freemen members, and then they join them. At this moment, Paul also embraces his new identity as the Kwisatz Haderach, his Bene Gesserit roles, and also his status as the new Duke of Atreides. All of these things he decides to basically become. The reason why they chose to end it there was probably because it concludes the first half of Paul's character development. At the start of the movie, it was exactly the prospect of having to fulfill these roles that Paul dreaded. He was rather unsure of himself and whether he could, quote, shoulder the future of House Atreides. The beginning and ending highlight the developments that take place in the story. If they had wanted to make the theme of the film the feud between the Atreides and the Harkonnen, then they could have ended it a little bit earlier in the story, after the betrayal by the Harkonnen. But instead, they went what is perhaps the more logical route, and chose Paul to be the central theme and character for the film. That way, it kind of turns into a coming-of-age story. Like I said, Paul has to become this Kwisatz Haderach, which amounts to him manifesting a certain potential that was stored inside of him. To do that, he has to cast away his old identity as Paul the Duke's son and become someone new, someone capable of carrying that responsibility. But with this movie, there's a problem, and that is that while the narrative is supposed to be about Paul, a lot of things happen that don't really involve him all that much. Like in the example I gave earlier, the movie could have been tweaked to be about the conflict between the Atreides and the Harkonnen, a conflict that Paul doesn't really play a large role in. As a result, the attention was taken off Paul's character for large parts of the movie, and it was only at the end of the film that I could really understand what the central theme had been, what the movie had really been about. Things happen in this movie, but they feel slightly disjointed, even though there is logical cause and effect between them. And I think the reason for this is a lack of focus on the main story arc, which is Paul's development as a character. The experience of watching the movie felt a bit like this. The Atreides move to Arrakis. There's an assassination attempt on Paul. They save a couple of people from a sandworm. Oh no, they're getting attacked by Harkonnen and everything's exploding. Okay, Paul and his mom survived. Now they have to find the Freemen. They found the Freemen. Now the Harkonnen are attacking again. But the heroes escape. Paul and his mom join the Freemen. Oh, the movie's ending. Some scenes in this film are very good, very immersive, and drag you in. But overall, I just didn't feel like I understood what the movie was trying to be about. I felt this the most watching this great action scene with the character Duncan Idaho, where he was escaping from the invading Harkonnen and managed to steal an airship and fly off. Between all of these explosions and all the destruction going on, it looked very great. It was a good scene. But I couldn't help but wonder, why are they showing me this? It doesn't really feel connected to anything, and that really detracts from the value that such a scene has. Because even though it's cool when Duncan runs up to a bunch of people and calls them pigs or whatever, you cowardly something or other, and like slashes them with a sword, and it's good. But he also doesn't feel important enough to the overall plot to really justify having the scene in the first place. I would like to emphasize here that I am still only talking about the movie. As far as I'm concerned, Book Duncan Idaho is a completely different character who I would analyze completely differently. So to summarize, events in the movie felt disjointed from each other, and the ending felt like it came out of nowhere, all because the movie attempted to make itself be about Paul's development as a character, while the story that was being told didn't fully lend itself to that purpose. A lot of what was being told wasn't really about Paul, and the coherence of the film suffered from that. This is the most important point to me about the film, but there are also some other things I want to talk about. Like I said in the beginning, Dune is a very large and complicated story, and I was curious to see how they would pack so much information into a movie. The first answer to my question was by splitting the story in two, and therefore gaining more runtime to tell the story in. So how were they going to convey all those ideas in a medium where the general rule is show don't tell? There are some instances of show don't tell in this movie, like with the shields, which aren't really explained. People just treat them like they are a given, and from the colors that the shields make you can kind of deduce what is happening. The same thing happens with mentats, the concept of the human super brain computer, like Thufir Hawat is for the Atreides. That isn't really explained either. We just see Hawat using his mentat abilities, and that sort of takes care of that. He isn't really used in the rest of the movie, and his abilities don't come up ever again, I think. But it is an example of the filmmakers not outright telling you what something is. As for the rest, however, almost all of the important concepts, like the Bene Gesserit, like what the Space Guild is, the spice, the different houses, all of that is explained through exposition dumps scattered throughout the first half of the film. And it's not exactly subtle. I believe there's a scene where Paul's mom almost looks into the camera and tells the audience what more or less amounts to the dictionary definition of what a Kwisatz Haderach is, just so we can get that information out there so we don't have to worry about it again, and then she moves on to the next topic. That scene can be defended by saying that Paul didn't know what that was, so he needed the explanation. And that's true, but it still comes across as very exposition dump-y, and at that point in the film, there's already been a lot of that. After the movie ended, while walking out of the theater, I could overhear people saying to each other how there was too much talking and too much explaining things in this movie. The very first scene is also a voice-over introduction of the planet Arrakis and the oppression of the Freemen under the Harkonnen. When this happened, I thought maybe they were just intending to bite the bullet now and tell us the things that would be difficult to explain naturally in other scenes. Making the audience sit through a mini documentary like this or read some text on screen, like for example in Blade Runner, can be an effective way of reducing the need for boring exposition later in the film. However, this opening scene only explains things that we are going to learn later in the movie anyway, so I feel like it's a bit of a waste. I forgot to mention one scene which delivered exposition very naturally, and that's the scene in the beginning of the movie where they are having breakfast, and Paul's mom uses the opportunity to test Paul in how good he is at using the voice. Paul's reaction to being challenged this early in the morning, and the fact that his mom uses every opportunity for a lesson, just feels very natural, and the entire scene is just well acted and feels believable and realistic. Despite the abundance of scenes where characters explain concepts in the story, there are also some things that I would imagine for people who haven't read the book could be a bit confusing. In other words, things that weren't outright explained, but perhaps could have done with a little bit of justification. For example, why are there so many swords in this movie? Everyone's primary weapon seems to be some kind of blade. Where are all the guns? And also, where are all the computers? Where are the robots at? The book explains this, but the movie seems to take it for granted. I worry that perhaps the filmmakers thought that they needed to explain the concepts that directly influenced the plot, but could neglect everything that Dune just used for world building. What I think could have been interesting is if they left some plot-relevant exposition more in the dark and used that time to explain things that have to do with the history of the world. This could potentially have made the story more immersive, because the viewer would be forced to think about the plot elements more, while the world would gain a greater sense of complexity, depth, and history. Perhaps they meant to make the movie more accessible by making the plot easier to follow. This they achieved by laying everything out very clearly for the viewer, but this also ended up having the effect of making certain parts difficult to sit through, the parts with lots of exposition and talking. In conclusion, the way the movie went about taking this very complex novel and adapting it into a different medium is sometimes a bit boring. But I haven't touched at all upon the different aspects of this movie, like the visuals, the style, the soundtrack, and so on. And I have really a lot less to say about those parts, because not much went wrong with them. It's a lot easier to talk about what you felt could have been better and offer solutions to the problems you see, than just sing praises to everything that went right. But a lot of things went right, and I'll quickly mention them. First of all, the sets, the environments are all quite typical of director Denis Villeneuve, considering his two other movies I have seen, namely Arrival and Blade Runner 2048. They have this open, kind of desolate, eerie feel to them, with large flat surfaces, and usually there are blaring horns in the background as the camera moves through these wide open spaces. I think it suits Dune well, and it's the reason why I was hopeful when I heard that this director was going to direct the Dune movie. The acting was really good, to the point that some scenes really stood out to me with how great the acting was. Paul was played very well. I thought maybe the actress who played his mom overdid it slightly with the emotional stuff. Duke Leto was fine. I have to give props to the guy in the beginning, in the scene with the ceremony, who played the Imperial Messenger. Because at the end of that scene, the Duke asks if the deal is done, if everything is over with. And the messenger just gives him this look, where you can see a mix of pity and amusement shining through, but very subtly. And you know, if you know what's going to happen, that he's thinking, man, you are so screwed. And he says, yes, it's done. And I thought that was a great moment. I also think Stilgar's demeanor is very interesting. When he first shows up, he strides into the meeting room with the Atreides and gets way too close to the Duke, causing everyone to draw their swords. He's straightforward and abrasive, but not because he's full of himself. To me, it became clear that his straightforward mannerisms were more of a consequence of having seen it all. Stilgar's confidence also reflects an attitude that was more in line with how I saw the Fremen when I read the book. I saw them as proud people who didn't think very much of off-worlders. I mean, for God's sake, they hunted Harkonnen for sport in the book, or at least they enjoyed fighting them. The only warriors that they slightly respected were the Emperor's Sardaukar, who were supposed to be the strongest fighters in the universe, and still it took on average 3 Sardaukar to take down 1 Freeman. This is why I thought it a bit strange that during the voice-over introduction in the first scene of the movie, the Freemen were painted much more like helpless victims. And while one could argue that they were still victims, I didn't get the impression from the book that they were supposed to be seen as all that helpless. Finally, to end this video with, I want to talk about the ending of the movie. As I mentioned previously, I thought that the ending kind of came out of nowhere. It was only when the movie ended that I realized what the narrative arc had been. I may have complained earlier that the overall story did not focus enough about Paul's character growth, but the truth is that there actually were a lot of scenes about Paul. The only problem is that there were also a lot of scenes that totally were disconnected from that. So we see that Paul has a lot of doubts about whether he will be good enough, whether he will be strong enough to fulfill his future duties. And the movie ends after Paul has a duel with one of the freemen, but he doesn't want to kill him. However, the duel cannot be over until he kills his opponent, and so he is kind of forced to symbolically kill his former self, who would have been hesitant to commit such an act. And this isn't me waxing poetic about Paul's development at the ending of the movie or whatever. The movie makes it quite clear in a pretty heavy-handed manner that this is what's going on, that Paul's former self has to die and make place for the Kwisatz Haderach. There is literally the voice of the head lady of the Bene Gesserit who tells him to kill his former self and let the Kwisatz Haderach rise or whatever. And this, at the very end of the movie, just drives home how this movie is not like the book, which was quite difficult to understand at first, but rather this movie puts on the training wheels and tries to make it very, very easy for you to understand what's going on. Then there's one final scene where you can see all the characters walk through the desert, and then the movie ends. So would I recommend this movie? For those who have read the book, sure, why not? It's probably fun to see all the characters in the world brought to life, even if you have to sit through a lot of people talking about stuff you already know. For just regular sci-fi fans who just want to see cool stuff, I would also recommend this movie. The imagery, as I said, is there, and the ideas presented are still interesting, even though if you really want to know more about this, just read the novel. However, I would be slightly more hesitant recommending this movie to someone who was just into really great film and wanted to see something great from a storytelling perspective or from an artistic perspective, I guess, because I don't think this movie delivers anything revolutionary from an artistic perspective. A lot of parts are good quality, some parts are a little tedious, and that's about it. I would give it a 6.5 out of 10. Anyways, thank you for watching, or just listening if you had this open in another tab, and maybe I'll see you in the next one.